They orchestrated a trap for her, anticipating her misstep, but Karoline turned the tables with such speed that even the host found themselves at a loss for words. The illumination was overwhelming, the lenses focused intently on her visage, and the atmosphere in the space was palpable. Karoline Leavitt sat opposite the host, her hands gently placed on the table, exuding a calm demeanor. She had conducted numerous interviews in the past, yet there was an unmistakable quality about this one that set it apart. Perhaps it was the manner in which the host, a prominent liberal commentator known for his combative debate style, flashed a smirk at her just before the cameras began to roll. Perhaps it was the knowing glances shared among the producers suggesting they had a scheme, a trap poised to be unleashed. The air was heavy with anticipation as the opening credits came to a close. The host leaned in, offering a gleaming smile that only partially concealed the underlying motive. "So, Karoline," he started, his voice oozing with rehearsed assurance. "It's a rare occasion when we encounter someone from your perspective ready to engage in a genuine dialogue. Are you prepared for that?" A delicate provocation designed to place her in a position of defense before she could utter a word. Yet Karoline had encountered this maneuver previously. She met his gaze with unwavering composure. "I'm always open to a candid discussion," she responded effortlessly. "I sincerely hope that we are indeed having one today." The crowd stirred, a palpable blend of laughter and eager expectation filling the air. The host's smile faltered, yet he continued with determination. "Excellent. Let's delve into the matter at hand. Numerous commentators argue that your party is disconnected from the contemporary electorate, especially the younger demographic. They contend that your perspectives are antiquated, failing to align with the trajectory this nation is pursuing. What's your reaction to that?" There it stood. The structure. It's not a question, it's an introduction. A setup crafted to confine her, compelling her to justify a stance she had never even adopted. Karoline inclined her head just a touch, as though truly pondering his remarks. She responded with a serene assurance that unmistakably conveyed her unwillingness to be trapped. "Are you referring to the young voters currently facing the highest inflation in decades? The individuals struggling to pay rent, much less secure a home? Those who are finishing their studies burdened by significant debt and stepping into a job market that is letting them down?" She allowed the words to linger for a moment before proceeding. "If addressing those concerns is considered old-fashioned, perhaps we should reconsider what contemporary truly signifies." A soft whisper swept across the crowd once more. The host adjusted his position in the chair. "Well," he remarked, clearing his throat. "Those are indeed economic concerns, but do they not hold any weight?" She interrupted, arching an eyebrow. "Is it because they don't align with the story you prefer to tell?" A handful of laughs echoed among the audience. The host managed a thin smile, yet his growing annoyance was becoming evident. "Yet, let's face it," he insisted, bouncing back swiftly. "The positions you hold and the approach of your party are perceived as outdated. The opposing side argues that conservatism is merely a reluctance to embrace change, holding on to bygone ideals. Don't you think that's a reasonable evaluation?" Karoline acted without a moment's pause. "That's quite a convenient point to bring up," she replied, resting her hands on the table. "However, this is the truth. Advancement isn't merely about altering things without purpose. It's about enhancing the quality of things. If you believe that challenging policies which have negatively impacted individuals is merely a refusal to move on, then I would pose the question, who is truly disregarding the facts in this situation?" Whispers floated through the crowd, with several attendees subtly agreeing. The host breathed out through his nostrils, changing direction. "All right, let's delve into the details," he said, leaning in closer. "You've expressed concerns about specific policies, particularly those related to free speech, yet there are those who contend that unlimited speech can be detrimental, facilitating hate and the spread of misinformation. Should there not be boundaries?" And just like that, the true snare had been laid. However, Karoline was not. Karoline stifled a grin. She was familiar with this tactic, portraying free speech as a threat, linking criticism to animosity, and observing the opponent's struggle with an untenable paradox. It was a worn-out strategy, crafted to portray the defender of liberty as the antagonist, yet she refused to allow that to unfold. "Allow me to clarify," she remarked, inclining her body forward just a bit. "Are you implying that the solution to combating harmful ideas is to suppress them?" The host's lips parted, yet she swiftly denied him the opportunity to interject, for here lies the crux of the matter. Once you begin to determine which expressions are permissible and which are not, you relinquish control to those who wield the authority to make the judgment. History often reveals that those who uphold the standards of acceptable discourse today may become the very censors of uncomfortable realities tomorrow. A wave of murmurs swept across the crowd. The host's smile faded, yet he maintained his poise. "Well, Karoline, that's quite a simplistic perspective," he remarked, straightening his tie. "There exists a distinction between free expression and speech that poses a threat, particularly that which incites violence or disseminates harmful misinformation." Karoline tilted her head, her expression calm and understanding, reminiscent of an educator giving a moment for a learner to grasp the concept. "Who determines what constitutes misinformation?" she inquired. "And you? What about the government? The very institutions that warned for years that challenging specific policies was perilous, only to eventually concede their mistakes?" She allowed the question to linger in the air. The audience was engaged, truly engaged. "That is the issue," she went on. "Free expression goes beyond safeguarding the ideas we find agreeable. It's about safeguarding those we often overlook. For the moment we begin to establish arbitrary boundaries, those boundaries begin to shift. And before you realize it, it's not merely perilous discourse that is being suppressed. It's challenging discourse, dissenting discourse, discourse that interrogates authority." A gentle whisper floated through the space. The host drummed his pen on the table, adjusting his position in the chair once more. "Well," he remarked, mustering a smile, "it seems we can all concur that certain matters, such as obvious untruths, ought not to be given a platform. Do you not think that platforms bear a duty to curb the dissemination of misinformation?" Karoline's eyes sparkled with a hint of mischief. "Are you referring to the time when prominent media organizations asserted that the Hunter Biden laptop was a product of Russian disinformation only for it to be revealed as authentic? Or when individuals faced bans for questioning specific public health measures only for those very measures to be reversed later on?" She allowed the words to linger in the air before continuing. "Who is responsible for holding those platforms accountable when they make mistakes?" The host blinked, his fingers gently wrapping around the pen. He had stepped straight into it. A palpable change swept through the atmosphere of the room. She sensed it deeply. Viewers had transcended the mere act of watching an interview. They were experiencing an extraordinary moment. A person standing firm against the unfair rules of the game. "I find it amusing," Karoline added, her tone airy yet exact. "It appears that the inaccuracies consistently align with whatever contradicts the favored storyline of the time. It seems to focus more on power than on honesty." Intermittent clapping. The host's smile wavered for the briefest moment, almost imperceptible, yet Karoline noticed it. "Well, Karoline," he began, clearing his throat. "Some may contend that a distinction exists between constructive discourse and the intentional dissemination of damaging narratives. Can we at least come to a consensus that there are boundaries?" She cast him a glance, gentle yet perceptive. She stated plainly that the First Amendment doesn't come with an asterisk. It safeguards expression, end of story. Once we begin to create exceptions based on individual sensitivities, we risk enabling the suppression of voices for any arbitrary justification. That doesn't reflect the principles of democracy. That's a regime cloaked in a polished image. The crowd responded. Not with great volume, but sufficiently. A transition. A moment of clarity. A fleeting insight that remained irrevocable. The host adjusted his stance, striving to reclaim authority. "Well," he remarked, "you're definitely not shy about stirring the pot." Karoline beamed with delight. Truth has a way of revealing itself. The host took a deep breath, rifling through his notes in search of a fresh perspective. He had to adapt quickly, yet Karoline was already 3 steps ahead. The host let out a laugh, one that concealed unease. He had grown accustomed to visitors floundering, tripping over their phrases, attempting to retrace their steps when faced with meticulously crafted allegations. However, Karoline was not taking on a defensive role. She approached this with a surprising lack of seriousness. And that's what added to the frustration. She exuded tranquility, seemingly unfazed, as though this was merely a routine chat over coffee. However, he wasn't prepared to relinquish control of the story just yet. "Very well, Karoline," he remarked, changing gears. "Let's discuss a topic that's been capturing attention in the news. You recently expressed your concerns about a proposed policy intended to address misinformation on social media. Isn't that precisely the essence of accountable leadership? Making certain that individuals are not deceived by harmful untruths?" Once more it appeared. That term. Perilous. He wielded it with precision, aiming to portray her dissent as thoughtless, perhaps even unethical. Karoline let out a soft breath, her head moving slightly from side to side. "So, if I understand correctly," she remarked, Do you believe that the government, politicians, and bureaucrats should hold the ultimate power in determining what is true and what is false? The host's jaw clenched slightly. Unfortunately, that's not the case, but, to be truthful, she went on, her tone steady. This isn't about halting harmful falsehoods. It's about ensuring that just one perspective is presented. Something we're both aware of. For centuries, authorities have consistently missed the mark. Yet, we are expected to accept that they have suddenly become the sole arbiters of truth. A handful of spectators chuckled. The host's gaze flicked to the side, assessing the atmosphere in the room. The situation was unfolding far from his original intentions. He emphasized that the issue at hand is that unrestrained misinformation can result in tangible harm in the real world. Shouldn't we take it upon ourselves to stop that? Karoline reclined a bit. Indeed, you are correct. Unwise choices can lead to significant repercussions. However, do you realize what halts poor concepts? Improved concepts, discussion, dialogue, not suppression. She took a moment, then remarked, and let's not act as if this fact-checking is unbiased. If that were the case, we wouldn't witness numerous fact-checkers unexpectedly changing their statements after months or even years. Isn't it amusing how that happens? A fresh ripple of whispers spread through the crowd. The host managed another smile, his grip on the pen tightening slightly. Well, he remarked, reaching for authority. I guess you would also contend that news outlets shouldn't face consequences when they disseminate misleading stories. Karoline raised an eyebrow, a hint of amusement flickering across her face. She responded by asserting that accountability ought to be mutual. Yet it seems that it does not, correct? When those in power and the media propagate misleading narratives that harm individuals, there seem to be no repercussions, no restrictions, no accountability, and no remorse. Well, it seems we made a mistake. And then they transitioned to the next endeavor. She allowed that to sink in before continuing. If we're going to discuss misinformation, let's be truthful about its primary sources. At that moment, the audience began to shift restlessly. The host blinked, visibly taken aback. He had anticipated a defensive response, not an aggressive counterstrike. He rifled through his notes once more, searching for something, anything that could alter the course of events. Karoline observed it, and she remained patient. At last, the host let out a breath, drumming his fingers on the table. All right, he remarked, trying to stifle a laugh. While your debating skills are evident, let's set aside the media narratives for a moment and focus on something genuine. Guideline. Lawmaking. What steps would you take to address the issues you've highlighted? It was a bold gamble, yet undeniably shrewd. Redirect the emphasis towards solutions, compel her to provide details, and portray her as either overly optimistic or unrealistic. Yet Karoline had been anticipating this moment. Karoline acted without a moment's pause. She was beginning to perceive it clearly. The change in his stance, the slight tightening of his shoulders, the quick glance he cast toward the audience as if seeking unspoken support. He felt the grip slipping away, and he was acutely aware of it. Are you seeking answers? She inquired, her head tilting ever so slightly. Okay, let's discuss some options. She raised a finger. To begin with, perhaps it's time for politicians to cease their charade as the guardians of truth. Why not allow individuals, especially adults, the freedom to form their own opinions rather than treating them as if they require a sanctioned perspective on reality? The host grinned, seizing what he believed was an opportunity. Rely on others? Are you referring to those who think the earth is flat or that consuming bleach can heal illnesses? An underhanded tactic crafted to undermine the validity of her points. Karoline merely shook her head. Good effort, she remarked. You understand precisely what I'm getting at. Fringe beliefs will always exist, but as far as I know, the solution to poor ideas isn't censorship. It's the presentation of stronger arguments. It seems more convenient to stifle voices than to engage in a debate of ideas. A handful of individuals in the audience offered their applause. The host's jaw tightened. She had more to say. She raised a second finger and said, let's discuss something different. Responsibility. News organizations, lawmakers, businesses, they constantly propagate misleading stories, and yet there are no consequences. However, when an independent reporter or an ordinary individual shares something that disrupts the status quo, they are swiftly banned, blacklisted, and branded as purveyors of misinformation, all without any opportunity to contest these actions. She inclined her body ever so slightly. If we are genuinely concerned about the damage that falsehoods can inflict, then why do those who deceive the most often receive the largest audiences? The host let out a forced laugh. Well, Karoline, if you're implying that businesses and the government collaborate to shape narratives, that seems alarmingly reminiscent of a conspiracy theory. She beamed with joy. Oh, is that the term we're using? Not long ago, labeling an incident as a lab leak was considered a conspiracy theory as well. Until it ceased to be. Isn't it amusing how that happens? Silence enveloped the room for a brief moment. The host's eyes flickered, darting toward his producers. He had to bring this to a close. Quick. He adjusted his papers and said, "Well, this has been a captivating conversation, yet it seems we may be straying from the main point. Let us." Karoline raised a hand. Additionally, after a moment of uncertainty, he motioned for her to proceed. She reclined, a picture of tranquility. She said, "You inquired about my plans to make things right. This is my final piece. Cease the charade that the sole path ahead requires a government-issued approval. Individuals possess intelligence. They are capable of engaging in discussion, navigating differences of opinion, and confronting challenging concepts. That is the essence of a liberated community." She allowed the words to linger. The host managed another smile, yet the truth was evident now. He felt utterly drained. "Well," he remarked, closing his papers with a decisive snap. "It seems we've reached the end of our time for today. Interpretation. This must come to a close before I lose any further ground." The audience applauded, with some expressing genuine enthusiasm, while others clapped out of courtesy. Karoline merely nodded, showing no signs of disturbance. The cameras switched off. The host took a deep breath, removing his microphone. Karoline followed suit. He inclined his body just a bit. "Lower your voice now. You certainly express yourself freely, don't you?" Her lips curved into a smile. "Ought I to?" He released a soft laugh. "This moment is genuine, if only for an instant." He rose to his feet, adjusted his tie with precision, and strode off the set. Karoline extended her limbs, reaching for her phone as a notification appeared on the screen. The initial segment of the interview had already taken the internet by storm, but that was merely the start of something bigger. Karoline hardly escaped the studio when her phone began to buzz incessantly. Notifications piled one atop the other. Writings, references, shares? She felt no surprise at all. As she entered the green room, a producer cast her a knowing glance. "You've shattered the online world," he murmured, shaking his head. She arched an eyebrow. "So soon?" He angled his phone in her direction. The footage was ubiquitous. A brief 90-second clip showcasing her skillful dismantling of the host's attempt to corner her had already been edited, captioned, and circulated on social media. The interaction was electrifying. Some were rallying in support of her, while others deemed her a threat impulsive. She merely offered a smile. The way people presented it was irrelevant. What was important was that they were observing and reflecting. Outside the studio, a throng of reporters was assembling, hungry for a quick quote. She straightened her jacket and plunged into the tumult. The inquiries arrived swiftly. "Karoline, do you believe your responses may have been overly assertive? Do you think traditional media exhibits a certain bias? How do you respond to those who label you as divisive?" She paused, allowing them a moment to regain their breath. "Have you ever noticed something amusing?" she remarked, casting her gaze over the cameras. If I had simply sat there, nodded, and concurred with everything the host mentioned, no one would label that as divisive. However, the moment a narrative is questioned, it becomes an issue. Several of the journalists paused, exchanging uncertain looks. Some inclined their heads in agreement, while others displayed their discontent. She was making it difficult for them to craft a catchy headline. A younger man in a navy blazer leaned in closer. "What do you believe caused this interview to gain such rapid attention?" After a brief moment of contemplation, she simply shrugged her shoulders. "Individuals are weary of receiving directives on their thoughts," she remarked. "They've grown weary of scripted exchanges that lack genuine substance. When they witness even a slight resistance, it jolts them into awareness." She pivoted in the direction of her vehicle. She had spoken her piece. When she finally arrived home, the interview had already surpassed 1 million views. Footage of her conversations surged across all platforms, analyzed and scrutinized from every perspective. Certain observers referred to it as a brilliant demonstration of dismantling media narratives. Some argued it demonstrated a transformation in the political landscape. A specific headline drew her attention. Karoline Leavitt demonstrates the art of triumphing unapologetically. She let out a breath, flinging her phone onto the couch. In reality, she hadn't entered with the intention of coming out victorious. She had merely spoken the truth. And if that was sufficient to stir the pot, perhaps the true inquiry wasn't centered on her at all. Perhaps it revolved around the reasons behind the reluctance of many to follow suit. However, this was not the conclusion of the discussion. The beginning was just unfolding. The following morning, Karoline awoke to a fresh surge of headlines, responses, and insights. Experts engaged in discussions about whether her interview signified a pivotal moment in media conversation. Some described her as daring, while others deemed her impulsive. However, one thing stood out distinctly. It wasn't being overlooked by anyone. She scrolled through the responses, stopping at a message from an unexpected sender, an independent journalist who had faced exclusion from mainstream platforms for challenging official narratives. Honor, the message conveyed. It requires courage to express what you just expressed. Karoline beamed. It wasn't about demonstrating anything to the host, the media, or even her detractors. It encompassed a grander narrative. The freedom to express oneself openly without the threat of being silenced for doing so. She reflected on the interview, recalling how the host had attempted to portray her as radical merely for posing inquiries and questioning inconsistencies. It was a familiar strategy. Transform autonomous ideas into a formidable force. Characterize disagreement as false information. Instill a sense of fear in independent thought. However, fear is effective only when individuals allow it to be so. She flipped open her laptop and began to type away. A straightforward communication. It's perfectly fine if you see things differently. It's perfectly fine to hold your own opinions. It is essential to have the opportunity to listen to differing perspectives and form your own conclusions. That's the essence of freedom. She clicked publish. In just a few moments, the interaction surged once more. A multitude of voices joined the conversation, some in agreement, others in dispute, yet the message had already been conveyed. The most impactful aspect wasn't emerging victorious in a debate. It would not be quieted. Karoline understood that the pattern would persist. There would be yet another interview, yet another debate, yet another effort to silence difficult discussions. Yet, as more individuals witnessed the unfolding events, the challenge of turning a blind eye intensified. With a deep breath, she seized her keys and ventured out into the world. There remained tasks to complete. If you value holding your position and forming your own opinions, ensure this dialogue continues beyond this point. Smash that subscribe button, share this video, and continue to seek the answers they prefer to keep hidden.